This story contains graphic content, intense violence, and disturbing imagery. It is not suitable for all audiences. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. I stood at the edge of Ravencreek as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of blood and fire. The air was thick with the stench of decay, a sickly sweet odor that clawed its way into my lungs. The town stretched out before me like a forgotten tomb, silent except for the faint moans carried by the evening breeze. Ravencreek was a ghost town now, its streets littered with the detritus of panic and death. The government hadn't bothered with niceties when they called me. No long-winded explanations, no empty reassurances. Just a simple, cold directive. Erase it. They didn't want survivors. Hell, they didn't want evidence. And that's where I came in. I wasn't here to save anyone. I was here to make sure no one ever remembered this place existed. I stepped into the town, my boots crunching over broken glass and scattered debris. My shotgun was heavy in my hands, the familiar weight a comfort in the eerie silence. The streets were deserted. The only signs of life, the occasional flicker of movement in the shadows. Remnants of the people who once lived here, now twisted into something far worse. The first one I encountered was a woman, or at least she had been. She staggered out from behind an overturned car, her skin pallid and stretched tight over her bones, eyes milky white. Her mouth hung open, blackened teeth gnashing as she let out a guttural groan, a sound that was more animal than human. I didn't hesitate. I raised the shotgun and pulled the trigger. The blast echoed through the empty streets, the recoil slamming into my shoulder. Her head exploded in a spray of blood and brain matter, the force of the shot sending her body crumpling to the ground. I didn't bother to look at the mess I'd made. There was no time for that. More of them were coming, drawn by the noise. I could hear them now, shuffling footsteps, low growls, the sickening sound of flesh dragging across concrete. They emerged from doorways and alleyways, their numbers growing with each passing second. Men, women, children, no one had been spared. Their eyes locked onto me, lifeless and hungry. I pumped the shotgun and fired again, the blast ripping through the torso of a hulking man who had once been a construction worker, his hard hat still clinging to his decaying scalp. His inside splattered against the wall behind him as he fell, limbs twitching in the dirt. But they kept coming. I moved quickly, methodically, the shotgun barking as I tore through them. Each shot was precise, aimed to destroy. Heads exploded, bodies crumpled, but there was no satisfaction in the slaughter, only a grim resolve. I had to clear this street, this block, this town. The government didn't want a single one of these things left standing. A child, no. A thing that had once been a child lunged at me, its small, filthy hands reaching out. I felt a pang of something, maybe regret, maybe anger, as I pulled the trigger, the blast obliterating the creature's face. It fell at my feet, twitching, blood pooling around it, soaking into the dirt. They weren't human anymore. I had to remind myself of that. Whatever had made them people was gone, consumed by the virus that now drove them to kill, to eat, to spread. I was just cleaning up the mess. The last of them on the street fell. A woman in a nurse's uniform, her body riddled with gunshots, her throat torn open. She crumpled to the ground, lifeless, and for a moment, the street was quiet again. The only sound was my breathing, harsh and ragged, echoing in the emptiness. I reloaded the shotgun, the metallic click echoing off the walls of the abandoned buildings. The night was closing in, and I knew it would bring more of them. But I had a job to do, and I wasn't leaving until it was finished. As I moved further into the town, I passed by the remnants of what had once been lives. Abandoned cars with blood-smeared windows, homes with doors hanging open, their contents spilling out onto the street. I could see the struggle in every scene, the desperate fight for survival that had ultimately been lost. And then I heard it, a low, guttural growl that sent a shiver down my spine. I turned, shotgun at the ready, and saw them. A horde, larger than the first, their eyes glowing faintly in the twilight, their bodies broken and twisted. They came at me in a wave, a relentless tide of flesh and bone. I fired, the shotgun booming, the shells tearing through the first wave, but there were too many. I reached for the machete strapped to my back as they closed in, swinging it with all the strength I had left. The blade cleaved through rotting flesh and bone, sending limbs flying. But still, they came. Blood sprayed across my face, the metallic tang filling my mouth as I fought, cutting and shooting, every movement a battle for survival. The horde pressed in, their hands clawing at me, their teeth snapping inches from my skin. One of them grabbed my arm, its grip like a vice, and I brought the machete down on its head, splitting it open like a rotten melon. The fight was brutal, a chaotic dance of death in the darkening streets of Ravencreek. But slowly, painfully, I began to push them back. My muscles burned, my lungs screamed for air, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Finally, as the last of them fell, their bodies littering the street, I stood alone, covered in blood and gore, my breath ragged, my heart pounding. The silence was deafening, the only sound the distant crackle of a fire somewhere in the town. I wiped the blood from my face and looked around at the carnage. This was just the beginning. Ravencreek was a hellscape, and I was the grim reaper sent to harvest what remained. With a final resolute breath, I turned and continued deeper into the town, ready to finish what I had started. The night had fully settled in, wrapping Ravencreek in a cloak of darkness that felt suffocating. The only light came from the distant glow of the fires that still burned, remnants of the chaos that had consumed the town. The air was thick with smoke and the unmistakable stench of decay, a combination that clung to my clothes and filled my lungs with every breath. As I moved deeper into the town, the streets narrowed, buildings pressing in on me as if the town itself was trying to trap me, to keep me within its dying grasp. The further I went, the more grotesque the scenes became. Windows shattered from the inside, doors ripped from their hinges, and everywhere, the signs of violence and desperation. Blood smeared across walls, leading into homes that had become tombs for the unfortunate souls inside. The virus had done more than just kill. It had turned the town into a grotesque parody of itself. What had once been a peaceful, if isolated community, was now a graveyard, haunted by the twisted remnants of the people who had lived here. And I was the one who had to bury them. The only way I knew how. I stepped cautiously into the town square, a once vibrant center now turned into a battlefield. The ground was slick with blood, bodies strewn haphazardly across the cobblestones. The fountain in the middle, once a symbol of life, was clogged with corpses. The water, a stagnant pool of red. I moved silently, every step deliberate. I knew they were here, waiting, drawn to the scent of the living. The shotgun was ready in my hands, the machete strapped securely to my back, its blade still wet from the earlier carnage. A low moan broke the silence, followed by another, then another. The sound was coming from all around me, growing louder, more insistent. They were close, and they knew I was here. I turned towards the sound, and that's when I saw them. Dozens of them, emerging from the shadows like wraiths. Their eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, their mouths hanging open in grotesque hunger. They moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, arms outstretched, fingers curled into claws. I didn't wait for them to close the distance. I raised the shotgun and fired, the blast lighting up the square for a brief moment, illuminating the horror that surrounded me. The lead zombie's head exploded, sending a spray of blood and brain matter into the air. But they didn't stop. They never stopped. I fired again and again, each shot tearing through flesh and bone, dropping them one by one. But for every one that fell, two more took its place. They were coming from every direction, closing in on me like a noose tightening around my neck. The shotgun clicked empty, and I slung it over my shoulder, drawing the machete in one smooth motion. The blade was an extension of my arm, cleaving through the first zombie's neck with a wet crunch. Blood sprayed across my face, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I moved like a machine, every swing of the machete precise, every strike meant to kill. Heads rolled, limbs were severed, and the square became a slaughterhouse. The ground was slippery with blood, making it difficult to keep my footing, but I kept going, driven by sheer willpower and the need to survive. One of them, a woman with half her face missing, lunged at me, her teeth snapping inches from my throat. I brought the machete down on her skull, splitting it in two, and kicked her lifeless body to the ground. Another came from behind, grabbing at my legs, but I twisted and slashed, severing its hand before driving the blade into its eye socket. They were relentless, but so was I. My muscles burned with exertion, my breath came in ragged gasps, but the adrenaline kept me moving, kept me fighting. The square was a battlefield, and I was determined to be the last one standing. As the horde thinned, I could feel the exhaustion creeping in, my arms heavy, my legs trembling. The zombies were slower now, their movements sluggish as if they too were feeling the strain. I took advantage of their weakened state, methodically cutting them down until the last of them lay twitching at my feet. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the crackling of the distant fires and the sound of my own ragged breathing. The square was a charnel house, the bodies of the dead and the undead piled high. The air thick with the stench of blood and decay. I wiped the blood from my face with a trembling hand, the adrenaline slowly ebbing away, leaving me with nothing but the cold and the overwhelming sense of emptiness that always followed a massacre like this. I was alone in a town that had become a graveyard, surrounded by the dead and the memories of the lives they once had. But there was no time for reflection. I still had work to do. The heart of Ravencreek was dead, but the virus was still alive, festering in the bodies that lay around me. I had to make sure that nothing would rise again. I began the grim task of gathering the bodies, piling them in the center of the square. It was hard, brutal work. But I didn't allow myself to stop, not even as my arms screamed in protest and my breath came in short, painful gasps. This was my job, my burden, and I would see it through to the end. As the last body was added to the pile, I pulled out a flare and lit it, tossing it onto the mound of flesh and bone. The flames caught quickly, the fire spreading with a hungry roar, consuming the bodies in a blaze of heat and light. I watched as the fire burned, turning the dead into ash, erasing the last remnants of Ravencreek's people. The flames danced in the darkness, casting long shadows across the square, and for a moment, I allowed myself to feel the weight of what I had done. I had cleansed the town. But at what cost? The dead were gone. But the memory of their screams, their lifeless eyes, would haunt me forever. The fire burned low, the last embers flickering out as I turned away, my steps heavy as I walked towards the church that loomed at the edge of the square. The job wasn't finished yet. The virus had to be eradicated, and there was only one way to make sure of that. The church was the last bastion of the infected, and I was the Grim Reaper come to collect. I steeled myself for what was to come, knowing that the hardest part of the night was still ahead. I pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stepped inside, the darkness swallowing me whole. The heavy wooden doors of the church creaked as they swung open, the sound echoing through the hollow sanctuary. The stench of death hit me like a wall, thick and suffocating, mixing with the smell of old wood and stale incense. This place, once a sanctuary, was now a tomb. A final resting place for those who sought refuge and found only horror. The interior was dimly lit by the faint glow of dying candles, their light flickering across the rows of pews now occupied by the dead. Bodies slumped in the seats, their lifeless eyes staring blankly at the altar. The virus had taken them all, turning this sacred ground into a grotesque monument to its power. I stepped inside, the soles of my boots scraping against the cold stone floor, the sound unnervingly loud in the stillness. The church was silent, but I knew better than to trust that silence. The virus didn't discriminate. Whether you were a sinner or a saint, it claimed you all the same. And there were still some in here, infected, but not yet dead. My shotgun was already loaded, each shell packed with the force to rip through flesh and bone. But it wasn't the gun that would bring this place to an end. It was the fire I carried with me, the fire that would cleanse Ravencreek once and for all. As I moved further into the church, the temperature seemed to drop, the cold seeping into my bones. The dead watched me from their seats, as if waiting for me to join them. But I wasn't here to sit down. I was here to finish this. The first of them moved, a low groan escaping its throat as it rose from the pew. The sound was like a signal, and soon the others began to stir, the church coming alive with the movement of the undead. Their heads turned towards me. their eyes glowing faintly in the candlelight, their mouths hanging open in silent hunger. I didn't wait for them to come to me. I raised the shotgun and fired, the blast echoing off the stone walls. The nearest zombie's head exploded in a spray of blood and bone, the force sending its body sprawling across the floor. The others began to move faster, a sluggish but determined advance. I fired again, and again, each shot tearing through the undead with brutal efficiency. The church became a battlefield, the pews splintering under the force of the blasts, the walls splattered with gore. I moved methodically, my steps careful, my aim precise. This was no different from the other battles I'd fought tonight, just another step in the grim process of erasing this town from existence. But there were too many. They came at me from all sides, more of them emerging from the shadows at the back of the church, their growls rising to a fever pitch. My shotgun clicked empty, and I slung it over my shoulder, drawing my machete with one smooth motion. The blade gleamed in the dim light as I swung it, cleaving through flesh and bone with savage precision. The zombies fell one by one, their bodies crumpling to the floor, but still they came. My arms burned with the effort, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Not until they were all dead, and even then, I wouldn't be done. A particularly large one, a man who had once been the town's pastor, judging by the tattered remains of a clerical collar around his neck, came at me with surprising speed. I barely had time to dodge as he lunged, his fingers grazing my shoulder. I spun, bringing the machete down with all my strength, the blade sinking deep into his skull. The light in his eyes dimmed as he fell, and I wrenched the blade free, blood dripping from its edge. The last of them fell with a sickening thud, and suddenly, the church was silent once more. The air was thick with the smell of blood and death, the bodies of the undead littering the floor like discarded dolls. I stood in the center of the carnage, my chest heaving, my clothes soaked in blood. Some of it mine, most of it theirs. I should have felt relief, but there was none to be found. This was my job, my burden, and there was no room for anything else. I wiped the sweat and blood from my brow, sheathed the machete, and pulled the flamethrower from my pack. The tank was nearly full. I hadn't had to use it much until now. The church needed to burn. The bodies needed to burn. It was the only way to make sure that the virus didn't spread, that nothing survived. I moved methodically, dousing the pews, the altar, and the corpses in a thick spray of fuel. The liquid soaked into the wood, the fabric, the flesh, preparing everything for the final purge. I paused at the altar, a massive wooden cross towering above me, its surface darkened with age. For a moment, I considered leaving it untouched, a final act of respect in a town that had lost everything. But no, nothing could remain. I doused the cross, watching as the fuel dripped down its length like black tears. Then, I struck a match, the tiny flame flaring to life in the darkness. I held it for a moment, the last flicker of light in this forsaken place, before tossing it onto the soaked wood. The fire caught immediately, flames racing across the pews, up the walls, and to the ceiling. The heat was intense, driving me back as the inferno consumed everything in its path. The bodies ignited, the stench of burning flesh filling the air. But I didn't turn away. I watched as the fire engulfed the church, as the cross itself was swallowed by the flames, leaving nothing behind but ash. The heat pushed me back, and I finally turned and left the church, the flames roaring behind me. Outside, the cold air was a sharp contrast to the inferno within, and I took a deep breath, trying to cleanse my lungs of the smoke and death. The flames spread quickly, the fire devouring the church and spreading to the nearby buildings. Soon, all of Ravencreek would burn, the entire town consumed by the fire I had started. There would be nothing left. No survivors, no evidence, no memory. I watched the flames for a while, their glow reflected in the snow that blanketed the ground. The town was dying, and with it, the last remnants of the people who had once called this place home. But there was no satisfaction in this victory. No sense of accomplishment. Only a hollow emptiness that gnawed at my insides, reminding me that I was the one who had brought this town to its final end. The fire raged behind me as I turned and walked away, my steps heavy, my breath still coming in ragged gasps. The dawn was breaking, the first light of a new day illuminating the sky as I left Ravencreek behind. But I knew that I would carry this town with me. The faces of the dead, the smell of the blood and the fire. It would haunt me, as all the others had. A reminder that in this world, there were no happy endings. Only the cold reality of the monsters we create, and the ones we have to destroy. The job was done. Ravencreek was gone, and I was still standing.